Finally forced out. The former Prince, now Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, has officially left Royal Lodge and will live in a home on Sandringham Estate in Norfolk.
Prince Andrew, now formally styled Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, has vacated Royal Lodge. After months of mounting pressure, he has left the historic estate and will now reside in a far smaller property on the Sandringham Estate in Norfolk. What may sound like a quiet relocation is, in reality, one of the most consequential internal reckonings the monarchy has faced in generations. The gates of Royal Lodge have witnessed more than 2 centuries of royal life. Queens, princes, courtiers, and confidants have passed through its long drive. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compares to what has unfolded behind those walls over the past year. A disgraced prince, a king forced to act against his own brother, and a residence transformed from a symbol of continuity into the epicenter of a modern royal crisis. This is not simply about a house. It is about power, accountability, and the future of the monarchy itself. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand what Royal Lodge represented. This was not just another royal property. The Grade 2 listed Georgian mansion sits deep inside Windsor Great Park, one of the most exclusive stretches of land in Britain. The house boasts around 30 rooms, 7 principal bedrooms, a private chapel, a swimming pool, manicured gardens, an aviary, multiple lodge cottages, and dedicated quarters for royal protection officers. More than luxury, Royal Lodge carried history. Queen Elizabeth II spent part of her childhood there. Princess Margaret ran through its corridors. The Queen Mother lived there until her death in 2002. When Prince Andrew moved in the following year, he was not just taking possession of a house, he was stepping into a legacy. And the deal he secured was extraordinary. In 2003, Andrew signed a 75-year lease extending until June 2078. The reported upfront cost was around £1 million. The annual rent? A so-called peppercorn rent, a legal term that effectively means symbolic, almost nothing. In practical terms, Andrew was living in a multi-million-pound estate for next to free. His former wife, Sarah Ferguson, joined him in 2008. Despite being divorced, the two maintained an unconventional but stable arrangement, living together at Royal Lodge for years. For a long time, it appeared untouchable. Andrew had the lease. He had the address. He had legal protection, or so he believed. Then everything changed. By 2024, Britain was deep in a cost-of-living crisis. Families were struggling to heat their homes, pay rent, and put food on the table. Against that backdrop, public anger exploded when it became clear that Prince Andrew, no longer a working royal, stripped of his patronages and engulfed in scandal, was still occupying Royal Lodge on a near rent-free basis. The optics were devastating. The outrage was instant and relentless. King Charles, acutely aware of the damage to the institution, had already been urging his brother to downsize. Frogmore Cottage was floated as an alternative. Smaller, more appropriate, less provocative. Andrew refused. His lease, he insisted, was ironclad. The law was on his side. Then came the moment that reignited everything. In 2024, Virginia Giuffre's memoir was released, detonating like a bomb across British media. The book revived and intensified scrutiny of Andrew's past associations, particularly his ties to Jeffrey Epstein. Headlines returned, public anger hardened, and what had once been a private family dilemma became an existential problem for the crown. Royal Lodge was no longer just a home. It was a symbol of excess, entitlement, and unresolved scandal, and King Charles was running out of room to maneuver. What followed would force a reckoning not just for Prince Andrew, but for the monarchy itself. The pressure on King Charles had become impossible to contain. By late 2025, public patience had evaporated, and the monarchy's credibility was once again hanging by a thread. The question dominating Britain was no longer whether action would be taken, but how long the king could afford not to act. Every day Prince Andrew remained at Royal Lodge felt like a silent provocation, an emblem of privilege untouched by consequence. Then came October 30th, 2025, the day everything broke. That morning, Buckingham Palace released a statement so extraordinary that it ricocheted across the world within minutes. Newsrooms interrupted programming, royal correspondents scrambled, social media exploded. The wording was precise, measured, and devastating. His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and honors of Prince Andrew. A reigning monarch had moved to strip his own brother of royal status. In modern British history, this was almost unthinkable. The last comparable moment dated back to 1917, when Prince Charles Edward was stripped of his Duke of Albany title for siding with Germany during the First World War. More than a century later, the crown was once again severing one of its own. The statement did not stop there. It continued with unmistakable finality. Prince Andrew would no longer be styled His Royal Highness. The title, Duke of York, was withdrawn. From that day forward, he would be known simply as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. No honorifics, no protections of rank, just a private individual. Then came the blow that made Royal Lodge untenable. Formal notice has been served requiring the surrender of the lease and relocation to alternative private accommodation. The 75-year lease Andrew had relied on, stretching until 2078, was effectively neutralized. The peppercorn rent arrangement that had allowed him to live in a multi-million-pound estate for virtually nothing was over. The legal fortress Andrew believed would protect him collapsed in a single paragraph. What stunned observers most, however, was not just the removal of titles or property rights. It was the moral positioning of the palace. The statement explicitly aligned the crown with survivors of abuse, emphasizing that the king and queen care deeply about the victims and survivors of all forms of mistreatment. This was the monarchy choosing a side, and it was not Andrew's. Privately, sources revealed that while Andrew was granted a formal 12-month window to vacate Royal Lodge, King Charles hoped the move would happen far sooner, ideally by Easter 2025. The urgency was not just logistical, it was reputational. Every additional week Andrew remained at Royal Lodge risked further erosion of public trust. The fallout spread quickly. Sarah Ferguson, long a loyal presence beside Andrew, lost her remaining royal styling. Though already divorced, the removal of the Duchess of York title hit hard. Friends described her as devastated, leaning heavily on daughters Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie as the ground shifted beneath the family. Meanwhile, the Crown Estate launched a full assessment of Royal Lodge. Andrew had reportedly invested millions in renovations over the years, and questions swirled about possible compensation. But as inspectors and staff entered the property, they uncovered something entirely unexpected: the hoarding crisis. As removal vans began appearing at the gates in late 2025, disturbing details leaked from inside. Multiple insiders used the same word: hoarder. Room after room filled to the ceiling. Decades of documents, photographs, furniture, and possessions stacked without order. What should have been a simple relocation became something closer to an excavation. One acquaintance described it bluntly: "This isn't a move, it's archaeology." Another added, "Even if Andrew wanted to leave tomorrow, he couldn't. The sheer volume of material makes it impossible." Royal Lodge, once a symbol of inherited privilege, had become a physical manifestation of Andrew's long resistance to change, cluttered, sealed off, and finally impossible to defend. And as the walls closed in, it became clear this was no longer about a house. It was about the crown asserting that some legacies, no matter how old, could no longer be carried forward. Think about what this truly reveals. This is a man who formally stepped back from royal duties in 2019, gradually disappearing from public life and retreating inward. Cut off from ceremonial purpose, stripped of influence, and increasingly isolated, Prince Andrew did not adapt. He withdrew. What investigators uncovered inside Royal Lodge was not simply disorder. It was a portrait of psychological stagnation. Room after room filled with documents, letters, photographs, memorabilia, decades of personal and institutional history stacked without hierarchy or resolution. Former staff described it as a shrine to a vanished identity. This was not casual clutter. It was accumulation as coping. A man unable to release the symbols of who he once was, preserving fragments of relevance in a world that had moved decisively on. The practical consequences were immense. King Charles had initially hoped for a relatively swift relocation, but the scale of the hoarding made that impossible. Clearing Royal Lodge became a forensic process. Items had to be cataloged, assessed for historical value, and separated from material deemed unsalvageable. Storage facilities were secured. Conservation experts consulted. What should have taken weeks began stretching into months. Palace planners quietly recalibrated expectations. Andrew's departure would not occur before his 66th birthday on February 19, 2026, and possibly later. Every room required careful, methodical clearing. And then came the most devastating revelation of all. The Crown Estate's formal assessment concluded that Andrew would receive no compensation for surrendering his lease early. Despite the £1 million upfront payment and millions reportedly spent on renovations, the property failed to meet lease standards. Dilapidations, structural deterioration, and damage caused by long-term overcrowding of spaces effectively nullified any financial claim. In institutional terms, Andrew was leaving empty-handed. He was losing his home, his status, and the financial assumptions that had sustained him, and there would be no soft landing. Then came the shock of where he would go next. When news emerged that Andrew would relocate to Marsh Farm, a small, working agricultural property roughly 2 miles west of Sandringham House, disbelief followed. Unoccupied for years after the death of a tenant farmer, Marsh Farm was described by those familiar with it as rundown, drafty, and in need of extensive renovation just to meet basic residential standards. The contrast was brutal. From a 30-room Georgian mansion with a private chapel, swimming pool, aviary, and manicured gardens to a modest farmhouse barely suited for solitary living. Friends described it bluntly. A shoebox by comparison. Sources close to Andrew revealed the truth. He never wanted Marsh Farm. His preference was Wood Farm, the former retirement home of Prince Philip. Larger, more comfortable, and emotionally familiar, Wood Farm would have allowed Andrew proximity to Sandringham House and continued quiet contact with the family. But the request was denied. And the reason was telling. Not placing Andrew at Wood Farm would have brought him too close to royal gatherings, especially during Christmas and major family events. Marsh Farm's 2-mile distance was not incidental. It was strategic, a carefully calculated buffer zone. Royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams summarized it succinctly. Keeping Andrew at Sandringham is a way of controlling him without placing him at the center of the family. By January 2026, construction crews arrived at Marsh Farm. At least 6 workers labored through winter rain, installing security infrastructure and repairing long-neglected interiors. A new 6-foot perimeter fence replaced barbed wire. CCTV cameras were installed, surveillance systems integrated. Yet problems persisted. The property lacked adequate garaging for Andrew's luxury vehicles, a detail that reportedly caused friction. There was no space for live-in staff. For the first time in his life, Andrew would not have a permanent household team. Instead, King Charles authorized limited support, a cleaner, groundsman, and cook dispatched intermittently from Sandringham. No entourage, no constant assistance. For a man who had never managed his own domestic life independently, the psychological adjustment loomed large. This was not just a relocation. It was enforced reduction, a life deliberately narrowed, simplified, and stripped of insulation. And for Prince Andrew, the reality was settling in. Exile does not always come with distance. Sometimes it comes quietly, 2 miles away. Prince Andrew grew up inside Buckingham Palace, a world where corridors were staffed, routines managed, and personal needs anticipated before they were spoken. For most of his life, independence was theoretical. Now, at 65, he faces a reality he has never known. Dependence on assistance that arrives only when scheduled, under conditions dictated not by tradition, but by constraint. One palace insider summarized the shift with blunt precision. It's a lot, smaller and far less luxurious than Royal Lodge. Another added, he hasn't lived anywhere this small since his apartment days at Buckingham Palace, and even then, he had free access to the palace grounds. Marsh Farm represents not merely downsizing, but enforced isolation. Then came the revelation no one expected. In January 2026, documents surfaced confirming that Marsh Farm sits on a designated floodplain. A 2024 flood risk assessment conducted for Wolfer and Barnes, just meters from the property, explicitly warned that the Environment Agency operates an active flood alert system in the area. This was not abstract risk modeling. It was a formal acknowledgement of vulnerability. The assessment went further. It noted that failure of the Wolfer pumping station, whether through mechanical breakdown or power disruption, could place nearby properties at immediate risk. Marsh Farm was listed among them. In such an event, emergency mitigation would rely on temporary pumping equipment and rapid response crews. In plain terms, Andrew's safety from flooding depends on infrastructure that authorities openly admit could fail. The timing intensified concern. As these details became public, Storm Chandra swept across Britain, bringing fierce winds and heavy rainfall. King Charles was forced to close children's play areas at Sandringham Estate due to hazardous conditions. Royal watchers noted the uncomfortable irony. The very weather patterns that threatened the wider estate illustrated exactly the dangers Marsh Farm faced. Questions followed swiftly. Were these environmental risks fully evaluated before the property was selected? Was the king aware of the floodplain designation? And if so, why assign a disgraced family member to a home carrying risks that other Sandringham properties did not? Some commentators went further, suggesting the choice may have been intentional. Marsh Farm's limitations, its exposure, isolation, and vulnerability, could function as a form of pressure. Not punishment, but discomfort. Enough, perhaps, to encourage Andrew to eventually remove himself from public British life altogether. Environmental risk, however, was only part of the equation. Security experts quickly raised alarms about Marsh Farm's exposure. Unlike Royal Lodge, which sits deep within the heavily fortified Windsor Great Park, Marsh Farm occupies open land with fewer natural barriers and less established security infrastructure. In response, authorities took an extraordinary step, extending Sandringham's no-fly zone to include Marsh Farm. This decision followed drone incursions over Sandringham in March 2025 during Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's visit. The new restricted airspace was authorized on September 16, 2025, and enacted on September 22, weeks before Andrew's titles were formally stripped. That timing matters. It suggests planning for Andrew's relocation had been underway long before the public announcement. This was not a reaction to outrage. It was a staged process. The official order stated that the Secretary of State had determined the expansion was necessary in the public interest. An explanatory note cited public safety and national security. Yet security analysts remained unconvinced that Marsh Farm could ever be secured to the same standard as Royal Lodge. The latter benefits from layered protection, restricted access roads, and decades of security planning. Marsh Farm, by contrast, requires retrofitting, patching vulnerabilities rather than eliminating them. One former royal protection officer put it starkly, "You can add fences and cameras, but you can't move geography." Taken together, the flood risk, the isolation, the reactive security measures, the relocation begins to look less like accommodation and more like containment. Not exile in name, but exile in function. For Prince Andrew, Marsh Farm is not simply a new address. It is a signal, a carefully calibrated message that his presence will be managed, his comfort limited, and his proximity to the monarchy tightly controlled. Sometimes, the most decisive royal actions are not announced with ceremony. They are executed through logistics. Sitting roughly 2 miles from Sandringham House, Marsh Farm may appear close on a map, but in practical terms, it represents distance, physical, symbolic, and operational. There are several paths ahead, and none are without risk. Andrew could pursue legal action, challenging the termination of his lease or the stripping of his titles, dragging the crown into prolonged and embarrassing litigation. He could give interviews, revive old grievances, or attempt to reshape the narrative by presenting himself as a victim of institutional betrayal. He could write a memoir, an act that would terrify palace officials, given what he may choose to reveal or imply. There is also the possibility that Andrew leaves the United Kingdom entirely, relocating abroad, perhaps to the Middle East, where he has long-standing contacts, would place him beyond the daily influence of the royal family and British public scrutiny. That move could offer him freedom, but it would also remove what little control the crown still maintains over his actions. King Charles has already crossed a line no modern monarch has dared to cross. He stripped his own brother of titles. He terminated a near-century-long lease. He forced a physical relocation that amounts to enforced separation. These were not symbolic gestures. They were structural, irreversible decisions. But the central question remains, has Charles resolved the crisis or merely postponed it? Because isolation can cut 2 ways. It can neutralize a problem, or it can radicalize it. A man stripped of status, dignity, home, and companionship, facing uncertainty, environmental risk, and personal loss may not go quietly. If you found this breakdown compelling, like the video, share it with anyone fascinated by royal drama, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Turn on notifications, because this unprecedented crisis is still unfolding. The crown has never faced anything quite like this, and how it ends could reshape the monarchy itself.